On a quiet morning in Willow Creek, the chapel was draped in white roses meant for a wedding that never came. The bride, Grace, stood trembling in her gown, clutching lavender meant for vows she would never speak. But before the silence could crush her, a sound broke through, nails clicking on the wooden floor. Her late groom's German shepherd, Atlas, leapt onto the casket, curled across it as if to guard his master one last time. The congregation gasped, some sobbed, and in that moment grief became living proof of loyalty beyond death. What began as sorrow turned into something greater, a reminder that love does not end in the grave. Stay with us, because this story will touch your soul. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. Willow Creek lay shrouded under a hard winter sky, a sky so pale and cold it seemed as if even the sun had forgotten to rise. The town was small, a scattering of wooden houses pressed against the shoulders of pine-covered hills, and its people had learned long ago to live with the rhythm of biting winds and snow that lingered longer than it should. That morning the streets were silent except for the crunch of boots and the creak of wagon wheels carrying mourners to the old chapel at the center of town. The chapel itself was a modest building, whitewashed timber with a steeple that pierced upward like a finger pointing at heaven, its stained glass windows glowing faintly with the soft light of candles inside. Rows of cars lined the gravel lot, exhaust rising in pale ghosts of breath against the frozen air, for today was not a wedding day, as it had once been planned, but a funeral. Inside, beneath the high beams of cedar darkened by age and prayer, the atmosphere was heavy with sorrow. The air smelled faintly of roses and wood polish, mingling with the unspoken grief of neighbors who had gathered to honor a man taken too soon. At the front of the chapel lay a dark mahogany casket draped in a flag, a folded emblem of service and sacrifice. Beside it rested a firefighter's helmet, scratched and blackened by heat, bearing the name Luke Miller. Luke had been only 29, a volunteer firefighter known in Willow Creek for his quick smile, broad shoulders, and the way he would carry groceries for the elderly without waiting to be asked. He had grown up in this very town, a boy who once broke his arm falling from a tree outside the schoolyard, and later turned that same restless energy into courage that saved lives. When the warehouse by the river caught fire during a lightning storm, he had been among the first to run inside. He never walked out again. The people of Willow Creek whispered of his bravery with pride and sorrow, their voices catching in their throats as they looked toward the woman standing nearest the casket. Grace Harper, the bride who would never become a wife, stood trembling in a gown of ivory satin that had been meant for vows, not mourning. She was 27, tall and slender, her figure delicate yet resolute, with auburn hair swept into a simple bun beneath a veil of black lace. Her skin was pale, the kind that flushed easily in the cold, and her green eyes, normally bright with quick laughter, were dulled by grief. She clutched a bouquet of lavender, her chosen wedding flower, now a token of farewell, in hands that shook so slightly one might not notice unless they were standing close. Grace had grown up the daughter of a local teacher, known for her intelligence and quiet strength. Friends remembered her as the girl who always volunteered to read aloud in church, whose voice carried clarity even when nerves trembled beneath. Now her voice was gone, replaced by silence heavy enough to crush. Her lips trembled, but no words came. In the second pew, a group of pallbearers waited for the moment when they would lift the casket and carry Luke to the frozen earth outside. Among them was Ethan Caldwell, a carpenter with sawdust permanently embedded under his fingernails, his broad face weathered and his dark beard streaked with gray. He had been Luke's childhood friend, the kind of man who never spoke more than necessary but whose loyalty ran deeper than the river that cut through Willow Creek. Ethan's jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out in ridges, as if by sheer force he could hold back tears. Around the chapel, neighbors and strangers alike filled the benches. Women in wool coats, men with hats held against their chests, children restless but subdued by the solemnity. The Reverend, a tall, thin man with a kindly face lined by years of listening, stood ready with a Bible open at his chest. And then there was Atlas. The German shepherd, only 4 years old, sat tethered at the end of a pew, his sable coat gleaming with black and tan under the flicker of candlelight. His ears stood sharp, his amber eyes scanning the room with the discipline of a soldier. Atlas was large, nearly 90 pounds of muscle and intent, his chest broad, his paws thick with the strength of long patrols at Luke's side. He had been Luke's shadow, trained not for war but for service, obedient, steady, protective. His presence was both comfort and ache, for many could see in the animal's posture the echo of the man who had been his master. The leash was held by Luke's cousin Daniel, a shy young man of 20 with sandy hair and a gentle disposition, who had agreed to keep Atlas near during the service. Daniel's hands, though firm, betrayed their tremble as he stroked the dog's neck. The service moved forward in slow cadence. The Reverend spoke of sacrifice and eternal life, his voice soft yet carrying through the rafters. Grace stood without moving, her bouquet pressed to her chest, her face unreadable behind the veil. The pallbearers rose, preparing to lift the casket for the final procession. And then, in the moment when silence seemed most complete, Atlas moved. With a sudden strength that startled those nearby, the German shepherd tore free of the leash. His nails clicked sharply against the wooden floor as he bounded forward. The congregation gasped. A woman dropped her handkerchief. A child cried out, but no one stopped him. Atlas reached the casket, and in one motion leapt upward, his body landing with grace and weight upon the polished wood. He circled once, then lay down across the lid, his head pressed where Luke's chest would be, his body curled protectively as though guarding his master one final time. His amber eyes closed halfway, his ears twitched, and then he went utterly still. For a heartbeat, the chapel was silent. And then the sound of sobbing rose from every corner. Ethan Caldwell dropped his hat to the floor, covering his face with calloused hands. Grace let out a soft cry, stepping forward as if pulled by invisible threads, her bouquet trembling so hard lavender petals scattered across the aisle. Even the Reverend faltered, his words caught in his throat. No one moved to remove Atlas. No one dared break the sacred tableau. Here was devotion in its rawest form, loyalty unbroken even by death, a love without language that needed no translation. In the back pew, a young girl named Sarah, 9 years old, freckled, with blonde curls tied back by a red ribbon, lifted her phone with trembling hands. She recorded the scene, unable to believe what her eyes witnessed. The clip lasted only 37 seconds, but it would capture the grief and the miracle of that day in a way words never could. When at last Atlas stirred, lifting his head slowly as though reluctant to rise, the spell broke. He stepped down carefully, returning to Grace's side, where he sat and leaned into her gown. She lowered a hand, resting it on his head, and for the first time since Luke's death, she allowed herself to weep openly. The chapel echoed not only with grief, but with a strange sense of peace, as if through the act of a dog, the spirit of Luke had been given one last chance to speak. The following morning, Willow Creek awoke to find itself changed. The video Sarah had recorded spread across social media, first through the small circle of townsfolk, then beyond. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. By evening, it had crossed oceans. Headlines read, "Loyal German Shepherd refuses to leave fallen groom's side." Reporters called, letters arrived, strangers sent messages of condolence. And true to small-town tradition, the people of Willow Creek brought what comfort they could. Grace's porch filled with offerings, casseroles steaming under foil, pies with latticed crusts, handwritten cards pressed between bouquets of chrysanthemums. Neighbors came and went, offering silent embraces, a hand on her shoulder, prayers whispered on the doorstep. Yet the most constant presence was Atlas, who lay each night at the threshold of Grace's house, his ears tuned to every sound on the road, waiting for footsteps that would never return. Thus began not just the mourning of a man, but the unfolding of a story larger than Willow Creek itself. A story of loyalty that would not die, of grief that became testimony, and of a bond between a woman and a dog who would not let her walk through the valley of sorrow alone. The days after the funeral settled over Willow Creek like a heavy snowfall, muffling sound and slowing time. The town looked the same. The diner still glowed with its neon coffee cup at dusk. The old mill wheel still turned sluggishly on the frozen creek. But for Grace Harper, everything had shifted. Where once the air had been filled with plans and anticipation, now it was thick with sympathy, and every knock at her door carried another casserole, another card, another reminder that her life had split cleanly into before and after. Grace moved like a ghost through her own home. She kept her wedding gown folded carefully in the cedar chest, but every time she opened the lid, the faint scent of lavender made her chest ache. Her auburn hair was tied back loosely most days, her green eyes swollen with lack of sleep. She was the kind of woman who had always carried herself with quiet dignity, a slender frame that seemed delicate, yet carried a backbone of iron. Now that dignity bent under grief, but did not break. She answered the door to every visitor with soft politeness, even when her voice cracked because she could not bear to add to the sorrow of others. Atlas became her shadow. Each night the German shepherd positioned himself on the front porch, his thick sable coat bristling against the cold. He was only 4 years old, but his solemn amber eyes made him seem older, a sentinel who refused to abandon his post. Neighbors would walk past in the early morning, wrapped in scarves, and they would see the dog lying alert, his gaze fixed toward the distant fire station where Luke had once reported for duty. They whispered about it at the diner over mugs of steaming coffee. Some said Atlas was waiting for Luke to return. Others claimed the dog was protecting Grace from the loneliness that pressed against the walls of her small home. Either way, his vigil became part of the town's folklore, and children craned their necks from passing school buses to catch sight of him, as if he were a monument. One afternoon, Grace forced herself to walk to the firehouse. Inside the locker room, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly, and the smell of smoke clung stubbornly to the air. She stood before Luke's locker, her fingers trembling as she turned the key given to her by Captain Harris, the station chief. Harris was a tall man in his late 50s with a square frame and a face carved by decades of fighting fires. His hair had gone silver, and his hands bore scars that told their own stories. He was respected as a man who had once carried 2 children out of a burning motel at the cost of his own hearing in one ear. He had known Luke since the boy was a teenager. Now his gravelly voice softened as he said, "Take your time, Grace." Then he stepped out, leaving her alone. Inside the locker she found Luke's helmet, scorched at the brim, a framed photograph of the 2 of them taken on the day he had proposed, and a postcard Luke had intended to send. The Schwau handwriting was familiar, slightly slanted, the words simple. "See you after the fire drill, love." Grace pressed the card to her lips, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt. She sat on the bench, clutching it, her slender shoulders shaking though no sound escaped. Atlas, who had followed her inside, placed his head gently on her knee, his warm breath anchoring her to the present. The townsfolk tried to help in the ways they knew best. Mrs. Dolores Whitaker, a plump woman in her 60s with a face as round as the pies she baked, brought over an apple pie nearly every week. She had lost her husband to a logging accident 20 years earlier and believed firmly in feeding grief until it grew softer. One evening, as Grace spoke with her at the door, Atlas managed to slip past and snatch the pie cooling on the windowsill. By the time Dolores turned, all that remained was a sticky trail of crumbs leading to the porch. Word spread quickly, and within a day a handmade flyer appeared in the window of the local convenience store. Wanted, pie thief. The poster bore a crude sketch of a German shepherd with exaggerated fangs, though someone later added a cartoon halo above its head. The flyer became a quiet joke around town, a spark of levity that people clung to. At the diner, Sheriff Bill Tanner, a barrel-chested man with a thick mustache and an easy laugh, tapped the flyer on the bulletin board and declared, "First dog I ever met who committed grand larceny with style." Bill was in his early 40s, known for his booming laugh, but also for the deep scar along his left forearm, a reminder of a car wreck years ago when he pulled a trapped driver through broken glass. He had carried that story into his work, treating even small-town cases with the seriousness of life and death. Yet even he couldn't resist the humor, and he winked at Grace when she came in for coffee, promising leniency for the thief. Grace managed a weak smile, the first one she had given anyone in days. Still, the sympathy of a nation weighed heavily on her. Reporters called at odd hours, letters arrived in stacks, and strangers wrote about how her loss had touched them. Grace appreciated the kindness but felt exposed, as if her private grief had been turned inside out for the world to see. She tried to retreat into quiet routines, sweeping the porch, tending the potted plants Luke had given her last spring, and reading in the evenings by lamplight. Yet the whispers never ceased. In town, people lowered their voices when she entered, out of respect or discomfort. Some offered embraces too quickly, others avoided her eyes. Grace felt herself caught between gratitude and exhaustion, her slender frame carrying both the love and the weight of all those watching. One night, as snow fell in soft curtains across Willow Creek, Grace sat by the window with Atlas curled at her feet. She watched the flakes gather against the glass, each one erasing a little more of the world. Outside. She thought of the postcard, of the helmet now resting on her mantle, of the way Luke used to laugh when Atlas barked at the vacuum cleaner. She whispered aloud, "I don't know how to keep going." Atlas lifted his head, amber eyes catching the lamplight, and pressed his muzzle against her hand. His warmth steadied her, and for the first time since the funeral, Grace let herself believe that perhaps she would not face this valley alone. Thus, the days after the funeral unfolded not only in grief, but in small, peculiar acts of grace. Neighbors who brought too much food, a flyer that made children giggle, a dog who stole pies but also guarded nights. Willow Creek whispered about it all, their voices carrying across the snowy streets, and Grace listened, caught between the sorrow that bound her and the fragile laughter that began to set her free. The storm that had taken Luke's life had passed weeks ago, but its scars lingered on Willow Creek. Along the riverbank, where warehouses stood like tired old sentinels, the air still smelled faintly of charred wood and damp ash. The skeletal frame of the burned building loomed against a pale winter sky, windows gaping like hollow eyes. For days Grace had avoided this place, afraid of what memories it might stir, but Atlas insisted otherwise. One morning, as snowflakes fell in listless drifts, the German shepherd tugged firmly at his leash. He was 4 years old, his coat thick and layered in black and tan, his frame powerful yet lithe. His amber eyes gleamed with intent as he pulled her along the frozen sidewalks, paws striking rhythm into the snow. Grace, wrapped in a navy coat, her auburn hair tucked beneath a wool hat, followed despite herself. She had grown paler since the funeral, her slender form seeming more fragile, yet she moved with the steadiness of someone who refused to collapse under grief. Atlas led her through the deserted lots until they reached the ruins by the river. The warehouse had been the center of the town's woodworking trade. Now it was blackened timber and twisted beams. Atlas sniffed furiously, his nose pressed to the ground near a scorched cottonwood tree that leaned precariously over the riverbank. Suddenly he began to dig, his paws tearing at the frozen soil. Grace dropped to her knees beside him, brushing snow aside with her gloved hands. From the earth emerged something glinting beneath soot and dirt. She gasped as she lifted it, a gold band engraved with simple letters, Gert's L. It was the wedding ring Luke had promised would never leave his hand. Tears welled in her green eyes, spilling down her pale cheeks as she clutched it to her chest. Sheriff Bill Tanner arrived moments later, having been called by a nearby patrol. Bill was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a thick mustache, eyes sharp as flint, and a scar running down his forearm from an old rescue. His presence carried both authority and warmth, the kind of lawman who could break up a bar fight with a laugh, but never forgot the faces of the people he served. He crouched low, his breath clouding in the icy air, and studied the ring. "That's Luke's," Grace whispered, her voice trembling. Bill nodded slowly. "Yes, and it proves something else." Bill explained that on the night of the storm, Luke had rushed inside the warehouse not once but twice. The first time he carried out a young boy. The second time he returned for a small object no one had understood until now. "He went back for the master ledger," Bill said, holding up a fire-scorched book that had been found near the debris. "The designs, the contracts, everything the carpentry shop needed to claim insurance. Without it, the family would have been ruined." At that moment, a man emerged from the shadows of the ruins. It was Henry Wallace, the owner of the woodworking shop. Henry was in his early 50s, his frame sturdy, though slightly stooped from years of lifting timber. His face was rugged, with deep-set eyes, and a permanent dusting of sawdust clinging to his flannel coat. His beard was peppered with gray, and his hands bore calluses as thick as bark. Once a proud craftsman, Henry had been on the brink of despair after the fire, knowing his livelihood and his father's legacy might vanish. Now, when he saw Grace holding Luke's ring and Bill carrying the ledger, his expression crumbled. With a rough sob, Henry crossed the snow and pulled Grace into a fierce embrace. His chest heaved against her slender frame as tears streaked his soot-marked cheeks. "If it weren't for Luke," he said hoarsely, "my family would have lost everything. He saved my boy, and he saved our name." Grace felt her body quake against his, overwhelmed by the raw truth. Luke's final act had not been a reckless gamble. It had been deliberate, sacrificial, and filled with purpose. Henry's son appeared then, a boy of about 10, with shaggy brown hair and wide, frightened eyes. He wore a patched winter coat a size too big and clutched a wooden toy car scorched along one side. The boy's name was Tommy Wallace. He hid partially behind his father, but peeked at Grace with shy curiosity. Atlas, sensing the boy's unease, lowered himself to the ground, tail thumping lightly in the snow. Tommy stepped closer and tentatively extended a hand. Atlas pressed his wet nose into the boy's palm, earning a small smile that broke through the sadness. The sheriff, clearing his throat, turned to Grace. "Luke didn't die chasing fire," Bill said quietly. "He died finishing the vows he'd made. Protecting, providing. That was who he was." Grace's hands shook as she slipped the ring onto her own finger. It felt heavy, not just with gold, but with meaning. She looked at Henry and Tommy, at Atlas pressing close, and realized something that stilled her grief for a moment. Luke's wedding was unfinished, but his marriage had already begun, sealed not by words in a chapel, but by actions in fire and smoke. The wind off the river howled, carrying with it the scent of ash. Grace stood taller, her auburn hair whipping against her cheeks, her green eyes burning through tears. She felt the presence of Luke in the echo of the storm, in the steady warmth of the ring against her skin, and in the loyalty of the dog at her side. Henry placed a rough hand on her shoulder. "We'll never forget him," he said firmly, his voice breaking but steady. "Not in this town, not in my family." Grace nodded, unable to speak, but in her silence there was strength. As the sun lowered over the river, casting crimson light across the ruins, Grace turned to leave. Atlas walked beside her, his stride purposeful. Behind them, Henry held Tommy close, and Sheriff Bill watched with a grave expression, knowing this story would live longer than any storm. Willow Creek whispered still, but now those whispers carried not only sorrow, but reverence. Grace understood. Her wedding had ended before it began, but Luke had already fulfilled his vows in the most sacred way, by giving everything for love. The night after her visit to the river ruins, Grace sat at her kitchen table. The small house wrapped in silence except for the occasional creak of wood as the winter wind pressed against the siding. A single lamp lit the room, casting a circle of gold over the table where a bundle of Luke's belongings rested. She had brought them home from the firehouse, the scorched helmet, the postcard, the photograph, and a small sealed envelope that she had not yet dared to open. Atlas lay at her feet, his broad body stretched across the rug, ears twitching every time the wind whistled through the cracks of the window. His fur glowed in the lamplight, a mix of black and rich tan, his frame muscular but at ease, though his amber eyes never strayed too far from her. Grace's auburn hair fell loose now, spilling over her shoulders, and the deep green of her eyes seemed darker than usual, shadowed by hesitation. She was tall and slim, but in that moment she appeared small, curled around grief that pressed down like a physical weight. Her slender fingers traced the edge of the envelope, the handwriting on its front immediately recognizable. "If I don't make it to our wedding?" Her breath caught, and for a long moment she simply stared. Finally, with a trembling exhale, she broke the seal. The paper inside was folded twice, creased by hands that had worked rough tasks, but had paused with deliberate care to write. Luke's handwriting was strong, yet slightly uneven, each word carved with purpose. Grace unfolded the letter slowly, and the silence in the room deepened, as if the whole house held its breath. "Grace," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then life has taken a turn I prayed it wouldn't. I don't know what the day will look like when this finds you. Maybe there are flowers still in the chapel. Maybe there is only smoke. Either way, I need you to know that loving you has been the only thing that made me feel whole. And because of that, I need you to carry 3 wishes for me." Grace's lips parted, her eyes scanning the lines, her heart hammering against her ribs. "First," Luke wrote, "take the bouquet you carried for me and give it to someone who needs hope more than we did. Weddings are for promises, but hope is for survival. Let that bouquet carry someone else when they can't carry themselves. Second, promise me you'll help Atlas find a new mission. He's not just a dog, Grace. You know it. He's a soldier in his own way, built to protect. Train him to be a therapy dog, to fight fires of the heart instead of the kind that burn buildings. Let him keep saving people even when I'm gone. Third, build a place where we can all be remembered. Not just me, but every neighbor, every friend who gave something they couldn't get back. A garden, maybe, a place of willow trees and benches, a place where people can come when words fail. Let it stand as proof that sacrifice is never wasted. And then, at the bottom, Luke had added a final line, scratched hurriedly, but with humor that felt alive even now. And for heaven's sake, keep Atlas away from donuts, or he'll eat the whole town's supply. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, choking on a sound between a sob and a laugh. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. Her shoulders shook, and Atlas lifted his head, sensing the shift. He rose, padded over, and pressed his muzzle against her lap. She dropped the letter, leaned down, and buried her face into the thick fur at his neck. The smell of him, warm, earthy, steady, anchored her as grief surged like a tide. After a long while, she lifted the letter again, her slender hands trembling less this time. She read it once more, and then again, each word etching itself deeper into her. She realized Luke had not left her only with grief. He had given her a path forward. And though she felt weaker than she had ever felt in her 27 years, she also felt something stir in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but purpose. The next morning, Grace visited the firehouse again. Captain Harris was there, the tall, broad-shouldered man whose gray hair caught the light of the overhead bulbs. His face was carved with lines that spoke of decades of fire and loss, and his voice, usually gravelly with authority, softened when he saw her. "Grace," he said simply, nodding. She held up the letter with unsteady hands. "Luke wanted Atlas to be trained, as a therapy dog." Harris blinked, then gave a slow nod. "Then we'll see to it." Later that week, Grace met with Dr. Karen Mitchell, the town's veterinarian, who also oversaw obedience and service training. Dr. Mitchell was in her early 40s, lean and athletic, with short dark hair and intelligent brown eyes behind rectangular glasses. She wore practical clothes, jeans, boots, a fleece jacket, and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years wrangling animals and their anxious owners alike. She had grown up on a farm, lost her husband in a tractor accident when she was just 30, and had built her life around service since then. Her voice was steady and reassuring as she knelt to examine Atlas, running gentle hands along his back and legs. "He's strong," Karen said, her expression thoughtful. "Too strong to be a pet alone. But I see the steadiness. Therapy dogs need that, calm under pressure, the ability to sense what people can't say. He has it." Atlas stood tall, ears forward, tail steady. His amber eyes flicked from Karen to Grace, as if waiting for instructions. Grace nodded, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her cheek. "Then let's begin." The training sessions started in the old barn behind Karen's clinic. Atlas was made to sit through sudden, loud noises, to ignore the temptations of food on the floor, to approach strangers with quiet confidence. Grace stood beside him, learning as much as he did, her tall frame straightening a little more each day, her pale skin regaining color as she laughed when Atlas failed and tried again. Karen watched with approval, noting how the bond between woman and dog grew with each exercise. At night, when Grace returned home, she placed Luke's letter on the mantel beside his helmet. She lit a candle there, the flame flickering as snow pressed against the windows. She spoke softly into the quiet, her green eyes reflecting firelight. "I'll do it, Luke, all three." Atlas lay curled at her feet, his breathing slow, his body relaxed after the day's work. For the first time since the funeral, the house felt less like a tomb and more like a place where life might begin again. And so the letter, meant for a day that should never have come, became the map of Grace's future. With Atlas at her side, she took her first steps into that future, carrying laughter, tears, and purpose in equal measure. The old community gymnasium had never seen such a crowd on a weekday morning. Folding chairs lined the walls, families pressed close together, and even the sheriff leaned against the back rail with his hat in hand. Word had spread across Willow Creek that Luke Miller's dog was about to face his therapy certification test, and nearly the whole town had gathered to watch. Grace stood nervously near the center, her tall frame draped in a cream sweater and dark jeans, auburn hair tied back in a loose braid. Her pale cheeks carried faint color today, not from makeup, but from the rush of anticipation. In her hands, she clutched Luke's letter, folded and worn at the creases, as if holding it would steady her heart. Atlas stood beside her, alert but calm. His coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights, black fading into rich tan across his shoulders. His ears twitched at the murmur of the crowd, but his amber eyes remained steady on Grace. He was ready. Dr. Karen Mitchell strode into the center, clipboard under her arm. Dressed in her usual fleece jacket and jeans, she wore her dark hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She looked around the crowded room, arching a brow. "Well," she said, her voice carrying, "I've never had so many auditors for a certification test." Laughter rippled through the gym, easing some of the tension. The test began. A volunteer wheeled in an old steel wheelchair, the kind that squeaked at every turn. Atlas was commanded to sit. The chair rolled past, its wheels rattling loudly against the wooden floor. Atlas's ears flicked once, but he remained still, posture calm. A murmur of approval swept through the audience. Next came the recording of a baby's cries, shrill and unrelenting. Grace's hands tensed, but Atlas only tilted his head, tail steady, gaze fixed on her. When she gave the signal, he calmly walked toward the sound, sat, and waited. The final exercise was the hardest, ignoring food scattered across the ground while approaching a stranger in distress. Karen herself knelt at the far end of the mat, feigning tears, her body shaking. Between her and Atlas lay an array of distractions, crumbled biscuits, jerky strips, even a donut someone had mischievously placed. The crowd chuckled knowingly. Grace gave the quiet command. Atlas padded forward, ignoring the food entirely, his nose twitching but his focus unwavering. He reached Karen, lowered himself beside her, and pressed his head gently against her shoulder. The room erupted. Applause thundered like a stadium, whistles echoed, and even the sheriff banged his hat against his knee. Grace covered her mouth, tears spilling over as Karen rose, smiling, and announced, "Atlas has passed." From that day, Atlas wore a green vest stitched with his name and the words, "Therapy Dog." And with that vest came new responsibilities, new doors opening, not just for him, but for Grace as well. The first invitation came from the Pine Creek Library, where the school hosted a reading program. Grace brought Atlas, his paws clicking softly on the tiled floor, his vest drawing eager eyes from children clustered around beanbag chairs. Among them sat Owen Wallace, the boy Luke had carried out of the fire the night he died. Owen was 10 now, with messy brown hair and round glasses slipping down his nose. His small frame was tucked into an oversized hoodie, and though his eyes were bright, they darted nervously when asked to read aloud. The librarian, Mrs. Clara Jenkins, a plump woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned into a bun, gestured toward Owen. "Would you like to read to Atlas?" she asked gently. Owen hesitated, lips pressed tight. Grace knelt beside him, her green eyes soft. "He listens better than anyone," she whispered. Atlas lay down, stretching his front legs, his head resting on his paws as if settling in for a story. With trembling fingers, Owen opened the book. His voice cracked on the first word, but he pushed through. The cat ran up the hill. Atlas's tail thumped once. Encouraged, Owen's voice steadied, each word coming smoother than the last. By the time he reached the end of the page, his smile spread wide, and the children around him clapped. Grace caught her breath, tears stinging. She thought of Luke, of the boy he had saved, now speaking bravely because of the dog they both loved. Later that week, Grace and Atlas visited the Willow Creek Veterans Center. The building was plain brick with faded flags fluttering outside, but inside it carried the weight of unspoken stories. Folding chairs lined the walls, a coffee pot hissed quietly in the corner, and men with weathered faces sat in uneasy silence. Among them was Hank Grizzly Thompson, a Marine veteran in his late 60s. He was tall but hunched, his broad shoulders bowed by time and memory. His square jaw was hidden beneath a thick gray beard, and his eyes, pale blue, carried shadows that never lifted. Hank rarely spoke. Some said he hadn't shared a word about his nightmares in decades. Atlas moved among the men, quiet and unhurried. When he reached Hank, he stopped, sat, and leaned his warm body against the veteran's knee. Hank froze, staring down at the dog, his gnarled hands trembling slightly. Slowly, he lowered one hand, rough with old scars, and laid it on Atlas's back. Silence deepened. Then, in a voice gravelly from disuse, Hank muttered, "Every night I see them. The ones we didn't bring home." His words cracked the air like thunder. No one moved. Hank swallowed hard, his hand still on Atlas. "But he's steady. It feels like maybe I can breathe again." The room held its breath. Then, slowly, nods spread among the men. One by one, they reached to pat Atlas, to let him anchor their trembling. The atmosphere shifted from heaviness to warmth, from silence to quiet conversation. Grace, watching from the side, pressed a hand to her lips. She realized Luke's second wish. The one about Atlas saving hearts instead of fighting fires was already coming true. By the time they returned home that evening, the sky over Willow Creek was painted with streaks of pink and violet. Grace sat on the porch steps, Atlas at her side, his green vest dusted with the day's work. She leaned against him, her auburn hair catching the fading light. "You did it," she whispered. Atlas rested his head on her shoulder, his eyes half closed, and for the first time in weeks, Grace let herself smile without guilt. Luke's letter had become more than words. It had become a life in motion, lived by paws and hearts across the town. Spring thaw came slowly to Willow Creek. Snow melted in rivulets down the sidewalks, and the river that had once carried ash now carried glints of sunlight. Grace stood outside her small white house one morning, holding Luke's letter once again. The words about a garden had lodged deep in her chest, stirring something that would not let her rest. She knew what she had to do. The idea spread faster than she imagined. By the end of the week, flyers appeared in the post office and diner, hand-drawn by high school students. "Help build the Willow Garden, a place where courage grows again." The town responded. Carpenters brought planks, children carried paintbrushes, and elderly women donated mason jars of seeds saved from their gardens. It was as if every soul in Willow Creek had been waiting for an outlet to turn grief into growth. Grace worked among them, her auburn hair tied back beneath a bandana, her pale skin flushed from the sun she hadn't felt in weeks. She shoveled soil with blisters forming on her hands. But when she looked up and saw neighbors beside her, Henry Wallace with his strong arms carrying beams, Sheriff Bill hammering nails with uncharacteristic clumsiness, and Mrs. Clara Jenkins directing children with her grandmotherly authority, she felt less alone. Atlas, now wearing his green therapy vest faded by use, trotted between volunteers, supervising as though he were the foreman. Children tied ribbons to his collar, and he bore them with patient dignity. A new figure appeared during those days. Nurse Emily Carter, 28, tall and graceful with chestnut hair braided over one shoulder. She had wide brown eyes and freckled cheeks, her figure slim from long shifts at the county hospital. Emily was known for her steady hands in emergencies and her tireless heart, though her friends whispered she had seen too much too young, losing her fiancé to a car accident during nursing school. She arrived still in her scrubs, carrying trays of lemonade for the workers, and she knelt to scratch Atlas behind the ears. "You're the real supervisor here, aren't you?" she said softly, earning a wag of his thick tail. Grace, watching her, smiled for the first time that day. On the third morning of work, Grace carried something wrapped in linen, her wedding bouquet of lavender and white roses, dried but still fragrant. She had kept it hidden, unable to look at it since the funeral. Luke's letter had commanded otherwise. Give it to someone who needed hope more than she did. She knew the moment had come. At the county hospital, Grace walked through the pale corridors until she reached the neonatal wing. Emily Carter was there, hair tucked into a surgical cap, her eyes weary but alight. A tiny infant lay in the incubator beside her. A baby girl born weeks too early, lungs weak but fighting. Grace approached slowly, Atlas padding behind, his nails clicking softly on linoleum. Emily looked up, surprised, but her smile spread. "I heard what you did," Grace said quietly, holding out the bouquet. "You stayed through the night. They said you never left this baby until she breathed steady." Emily's eyes glistened as she touched the brittle petals. "It wasn't just me," she whispered, "but thank you." Grace pressed the bouquet into her hands. Luke wanted the first flowers of our wedding to go to someone who needed hope. That someone is you. Tears filled Emily's eyes. Atlas, sensing the shift, raised his front paws onto the bed and gently laid his chin beside the infant's tiny body. The baby squirmed, released a fragile cry, and the room filled with laughter. Even the attending doctor chuckled softly. Hope bloomed where grief had stood. Weeks later, on a golden May afternoon, the willow garden opened. It stood at the edge of town, where the river bent and willows grew tall, their branches trailing like green curtains. Grace wore a simple navy dress, her auburn hair loose for once, glowing in the sunlight. Around her gathered the town, veterans in pressed jackets, children holding jars of daisies, parents hand in hand. Wooden benches circled a stone path, and at its heart stood a willow tree, with branches strong enough to carry dreams. At the dedication, Sheriff Bill Tanner spoke first, his mustache twitching as he tried to steady his voice. "This garden isn't just for Luke. It's for every one of us who gave something we couldn't get back. May this be a place where courage grows again." He stepped aside, and Grace lit the first candle in a lantern hanging from the willow's bough. Then others followed, adding their own tokens, photographs, medals, small wooden carvings. Finally, Mrs. Jenkins passed out glass wind chimes strung with colored beads, crafted by children at the school. One by one, townspeople tied them to the willow's branches. When the evening breeze stirred, the garden came alive with sound, soft, tinkling notes that shimmered like whispers from unseen voices. Some bowed their heads, others smiled through tears. Grace closed her eyes, and for a fleeting moment she could almost hear Luke's laugh carried in the chimes. Atlas sat at her feet, his ears pricked, his amber eyes scanning the sky. When the wind lifted again, the chimes rang louder, a chorus of fragile bells. Atlas raised his head, listening with an intensity that hushed the crowd. His tail thumped once, as if receiving an order only he could hear. Grace laid a hand on his back. "You hear him too, don't you?" she whispered. The garden had been born from loss, but it now pulsed with life. Children darted between benches, veterans sat in reflective silence, and neighbors held hands under the willow's shade. For the first time since the storm night, Willow Creek felt whole again, and as the chimes sang in the twilight, Grace knew Luke's wishes had been fulfilled. The bouquet, the therapy dog, the garden. Out of ashes, courage had indeed grown. Time 0.5. 1 year had passed since the Willow Garden first opened its gates. The seasons had turned and carried the town from grief into something gentler, something stitched together with laughter and remembrance. On a late spring afternoon, golden light streamed through the willow branches, casting dancing shadows on the ground. The garden was alive. Children ran between benches, veterans sat in quiet clusters, and glass wind chimes strung to branches shimmered with sound at the slightest breeze. At the heart of the garden stood the wooden bench carved by Henry Wallace and his carpenters, its backrest inscribed with careful letters. In memory of Luke Miller, where courage grows again. Flowers bloomed at its base, lavender mingling with daisies, their colors bright against the grain of polished oak. It was here the town gathered once more, not for mourning, but for celebration. Grace walked down the stone path, her auburn hair loose and gleaming in the sunlight. She wore a simple navy dress, the same shade Luke had always said made her green eyes shine brighter. Her figure remained slender but stronger now, as though purpose had added invisible weight to her frame. She carried a small leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with ink and promise. Atlas padded beside her, his sable and tan coat catching the sun, his amber eyes calm but alert, a steady presence as he had always been. The townsfolk parted gently to make space. At the front stood Sheriff Bill Tanner, his mustache thicker now, though his eyes still sharp with pride. Nearby, Mrs. Clara Jenkins clutched a jar of daisies, while Owen Wallace, taller now, glasses perched more confidently on his nose, waved shyly to Grace. Nurse Emily Carter was also present, her chestnut braid swinging as she adjusted the stroller beside her. Inside lay the baby girl she had once kept alive through that long night, now rosy-cheeked and wide-eyed. Grace stepped to the bench, laid her hand upon the carved name, and opened her notebook. Her voice carried softly but firmly over the garden. "Luke," she began, "a year has gone, but your vow hasn't ended. Today I write mine." Her eyes swept the faces before her, then returned to the bench. "I vow to live so that your name is hope for someone else. I vow to keep courage growing here, in every child who learns to read, in every veteran who dares to speak again, in every garden bell that rings when the wind calls." Her voice trembled, but she steadied it, wiping one tear with the back of her hand. "And I vow to laugh, because you wanted that too." As if on cue, laughter broke through the air. Atlas, who had been lying dutifully at her feet, suddenly bounded forward and leapt onto the wooden bench. He curled into a circle, resting his chin atop Luke's name. The crowd chuckled softly, some wiping tears, as if recognizing the shift. Atlas was no longer the grieving guardian, but a companion at peace. Then came the surprise that rippled joy through the gathering. From the refreshment table, decorated with banners for the new One More Life program, volunteers wheeled out what looked like a cake draped in white frosting. But when the covering was lifted, laughter burst like firecrackers. It was not a cake at all, but a donut, an enormous glazed circle nearly the size of a wagon wheel, made by the town's bakery, as both a joke and a fundraiser. A sign leaned against it. "In honor of Luke, to train the next generation of therapy dogs. Before anyone could cut the first piece, Atlas bounded off the bench, tail wagging furiously. He sniffed once, then stretched his long neck forward and gave the giant donut a bold bite. Gasps, then roars of laughter filled the garden. Children squealed, adults clapped, and even the stoic veterans chuckled. Grace covered her face with one hand, laughing through her tears. "Luke warned us," she said between breaths. "He said to keep Atlas away from donuts." The giant pastry wobbled but remained intact, leaving Atlas with only a sticky muzzle and a triumphant thump of his tail. The crowd cheered louder, tossing bills into the donation jar beside the table, as if the dog's mischief itself were the best blessing for the new program. As the laughter faded, the church bells from nearby Willow Chapel began to toll, their sound rolling across the garden in solemn music. The glass wind chimes swayed, answering in 1,000 delicate notes. Atlas froze, ears pricked, head lifted toward the sky. For a long moment he stood utterly still, amber eyes locked on the clouds above, his tail flicking once, twice. Then he exhaled softly, lowered his head, and leaned back into Grace's side as though accepting something unseen. Grace placed her hand on his back, her green eyes shining. She whispered, just loud enough for the breeze to carry. "He passed the last command to you, didn't he?" The town fell into a reverent hush, watching the dog and the woman stand before the bench inscribed with Luke's name. And in that silence, broken only by bells and chimes, everyone felt it. The vows of love, of sacrifice, and of laughter had not ended with Luke's life. They had become something larger, shared by all, embodied in a dog who had once leapt onto a casket and now lay peacefully at rest. The day closed with children running through the garden, bells tinkling, and Atlas stretched contentedly on the grass. Grace closed her notebook, heart lighter than it had been in a year. Luke's legacy lived on, not just in memory, but in every vow renewed by those left behind. Sometimes God does not send angels with wings. He sends them with paws, steady eyes, and a heart that never gives up on us. Atlas was more than Luke's dog. He was a reminder that love can survive the grave, that sacrifice plants seeds which blossom long after, and that hope can be carried forward even by 4 legs and a wagging tail. In our daily lives, we often forget that the smallest gestures, offering kindness to a neighbor, listening to someone's silent pain, or giving our time when it feels inconvenient, are themselves miracles. Through these acts, God whispers, "Love never dies, it only changes form." If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to honor Atlas and the heroes like Luke, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that God's light still shines, even in the darkest nights. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He give strength to your days and peace to your nights. And if you believe love is the greatest miracle of all, type Amen in the comments below.